My name is Clara Harrington, and I was 34 the year my older brother decided that the laws of physics were merely a suggestion that didn't apply to his aesthetic vision. He waited until the ink on our mother's death certificate was barely dry to funnel the entirety of her life insurance payout into a sheer, crumbling cliffside in Malibu, California. My brother, Julian, would later stand in the pristine, imported gravel driveway of his $15 million mega mansion, his perfectly tailored suit soaked in nervous sweat, screaming at a city inspector while a massive neon red condemned placard was stapled to his custom mahogany front door. He genuinely believed he was a visionary real estate developer who had been targeted by a jealous, bitter sister. He had absolutely no idea that when I quietly walked away from his construction site a year prior, I wasn't surrendering. I was simply stepping out of the way of gravity. Welcome back to Whispered Drama Stories. We tell quiet, true-to-life family and relationship stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a family narrative they never wrote. If a calm woman with a set of geological core samples, a flawless understanding of soil mechanics, and an airtight federal engineering stamp is your idea of justice, you are in the right place. People fundamentally misunderstand what a geotechnical civil engineer actually does. To the general public, building a house is about the architecture. They look at the sweeping roof lines, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and the infinity pools, and they think that is the mastery of construction. But architects just draw pretty pictures. Engineers are the ones who keep those pictures from killing people. My job is entirely invisible. I deal with what lies beneath the dirt. I study seismic load transfers, subterranean hydrology, and the sheer strength of bedrock. I design the massive, subterranean steel and concrete anchors that hold humanity's grandest illusions firmly to the earth. I built my entire professional career on the principle of absolute, microscopic accountability. I don't argue with gravity. I just calculate the breaking point. I trusted soil borings. I trusted load-bearing mathematics. I trusted the undeniable reality that if you build a massive structure on a weak foundation, it is only a matter of time before the earth reclaims it. Unfortunately, I was raised in a family that treated reality like an inconvenient rumor, valuable only if you could put a filter on it and sell it to the highest bidder. In my family, there was my older brother Julian, and there was me. Julian was 36, aggressively handsome, and entirely obsessed with the aesthetic of extreme wealth. He called himself a luxury lifestyle entrepreneur, which is a very generous, modern term for a man who leased European sports cars he couldn't afford, wore $50,000 watches on credit, and posted drone footage of other people's mansions on his Instagram to sell the illusion that he was a major player in the Los Angeles real estate market. My mother, Eleanor, was Julian's primary enabler and his absolute biggest fan. Eleanor was a woman who believed that surface appearance was the only metric of human value. To Eleanor, Julian's flashy, debt-ridden lifestyle was proof of his ambition. To Eleanor and Julian, my career as a civil engineer was an absolute mystery, and therefore, it was an embarrassment. I didn't drive a leased Porsche. I drove a heavily modified four-wheel drive utility truck that was usually covered in mud from my job site. I spent my days wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat, analyzing soil density reports for commercial high-rises and municipal bridges. I was quiet, methodical, and profoundly happy in my world of absolute mathematical truth. But because I didn't fit into Julian's curated high-gloss aesthetic, I was the family scapegoat. I was too serious. I was boring. Clara, sweetheart, my mother would sigh, inspecting her flawless manicure while standing in my modest, perfectly functional apartment. You spend your entire life playing in the dirt with construction workers. You're brilliant. I know. But when are you going to use that brain to actually make something beautiful? Julian is networking with billionaires in Beverly Hills. You could at least ask him to introduce you to a nice developer. I rarely fought back. Arguing with my mother was like trying to explain a complex differential equation to someone who refuses to acknowledge that numbers exist. It was a total waste of energy. I would just smile, offer her a cup of tea, and go back to my blueprints. I didn't need Julian's networking. I was a senior partner at one of the most respected engineering firms in Southern California. The fragile, polite distance in our family shattered the winter my mother suddenly passed away from a fast-moving illness. The grief was heavy and exhausting. I spent weeks organizing the funeral, handling the hospital bills, and managing the logistics of her estate, while Julian flew out to Cabo San Lucas to process his grief at a luxury resort. But the real betrayal didn't become apparent until the lawyer read her will. My mother had a substantial life insurance policy. It was a $2 million payout. For my entire life, it had been explicitly understood that the policy was to be split 50-50 between Julian and me. It was meant to be my safety net, my seed money to eventually open my own independent engineering firm. When the lawyer opened the final, amended documents in his stuffy downtown office, Julian's masterpiece of manipulation was laid bare. 6 months before she died, while I was working 80-hour weeks on a municipal dam project, Julian had convinced our mother to change the beneficiary designation. He had convinced her that leaving me $1 million in cash would be wasted on my boring lifestyle. Instead, he promised her that if she gave him the entire $2 million payout, he would use it as capital to launch his own ultra-luxury real estate development firm. He promised her he would generate a guaranteed 500% return on investment, and that he would take care of me with the massive profits. My mother had signed the entire $2 million over to him. I was left with absolutely nothing but a box of her old photo albums. Julian didn't even try to hide his absolute, ecstatic triumph. He sat in the lawyer's office, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. "Look, Clara," Julian had said smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie. "I know this stings right now, but Mom believed in my vision. $2 million is exactly the seed capital I need to break into the Malibu mega mansion market. You don't know how to multiply money. I do. I'm going to build a legacy for this family." I sat quietly in my chair. I didn't yell. I didn't cry about the unfairness of the will. I am an engineer. When a structural support is removed without warning, you don't scream at the empty space. You brace the surrounding load and reevaluate the blueprint. 2 months later, Julian purchased his plot of land. It was a highly coveted, deeply problematic piece of real estate sitting on a sheer cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Malibu. To the naked, untrained eye, it was paradise. A sweeping, unobstructed 180-degree view of the water, catching the golden hour light perfectly. Julian bought it for a suspiciously low price of $3 million, leveraging our mother's life insurance payout as a massive down payment to secure a high-interest commercial construction loan. He planned to build a 10,000-square-foot tri-level glass box. He wanted a cantilevered infinity pool that hung off the edge of the cliff, a subterranean garage with a glass-bottomed floor, and thousands of square feet of imported Italian marble. He intended to build it for $8 million and flip it to a tech billionaire for $25 million. A week after closing on the land, Julian called me into his newly leased, excessively flashy corporate office in Beverly Hills. "Clara," Julian beamed, sitting behind a massive glass desk that he had absolutely no practical use for. "The Malibu project is officially a go. The architects have finished the renderings. It's going to be the most photographed house in California." He slid a glossy, bound portfolio across the desk. I opened it. The house was, admittedly, beautiful. It was a massive, heavy structure of steel and glass, perched aggressively close to the cliff edge. "It's very ambitious, Julian," I said neutrally. "It's a masterpiece," he corrected me. "But here's the thing. The architectural firm wants to charge me an absolute fortune to subcontract the structural and geotechnical engineering blueprints for the city permits. It's a complete ripoff for drawing a few concrete lines." He leaned forward, adopting his most charming, persuasive smile. "I want to keep this in the family, Clara. Mom would have wanted you to be a part of her legacy. I want you to run the soil tests and stamp the foundation blueprints for me, as a favor. You know, sweat equity for the family empire." He wanted me to perform roughly $200,000 worth of highly specialized, legally binding engineering work for free, to save money on the house he was building with the money he had stolen from me. I looked at my brother. I knew he was a narcissist. I knew he was using me. But I also knew that the cliff he had just purchased was located in one of the most geologically volatile zones in Southern California. If he hired a cut-rate, cheap engineer who rubber-stamped a flawed foundation, people could die. I will run the geological survey and draft the preliminary foundation blueprints, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly flat, but I will not stamp them for city approval until I have personally verified every single core sample. I do not do favors with my engineering license, Julian. Of course, Julian laughed, waving his hand dismissively. Just tell me where to pour the concrete. I spent the next 3 weeks on the cliffside in Malibu. I brought in my crew. We drilled deep geological core samples, extracting cylinders of earth from 60 feet below the surface. We ran seismic refraction tests. We monitored the subterranean hydrology, the way groundwater moved through the cliff after a heavy rain. When the lab results came back, my blood ran cold. The property was a geological nightmare. It was cheap for a reason. The top 10 feet of the cliff was decent, compacted sandstone. But beneath that, resting at a 20-degree downward angle directly toward the ocean, was a massive layer of bentonite clay. In geotechnical engineering, this is known as a slip plane. When bentonite clay gets wet from winter rains or irrigation, it becomes incredibly slick. If you build a massive, heavy structure on the topsoil, the sheer weight of the house will eventually cause the top layer of earth to detach from the bedrock and slide down the slick clay plane, taking the entire house straight into the Pacific Ocean. The only way to safely build a 10,000 square foot house on that specific cliff was to anchor it completely through the slip plane. It required a massive, subterranean retaining wall system. It required drilling 30 massive steel and concrete friction piles, called caissons, 60 feet deep, sinking them directly into the solid, unmoving bedrock at the base of the cliff. I drafted the blueprints. The foundation was a masterpiece of safety and load distribution, but it was going to be breathtakingly expensive. I printed the massive 24 by 36-inch architectural blueprints and brought them to Julian's office. I unrolled them across his glass desk. I have the geological reports, Julian, I said, pointing to the cross-section diagrams. The bedrock is severely compromised. You have a massive slip plane of bentonite clay angled toward the water. If you pour a standard slab foundation, this house will slide off the cliff within 5 years. Julian frowned, staring at the complex web of steel caissons I had drawn deep into the earth. Okay, so we drill some deeper holes. Fine. What's the budget adjustment? To properly secure this structure, I stated clearly, the foundation alone will cost $1.8 million, and it will take 4 months of drilling before you can even begin framing the house. Julian stopped breathing. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and immediate, visceral rage. $1.8 million? Julian whispered, his voice trembling. For the dirt? For something no one is ever going to see? For the foundation that keeps your house from falling into the ocean? I corrected him. No! Julian exploded, slamming his hands down on the blueprints. Absolutely not! Do you know what $1.8 million buys, Clara? That's the entire budget for my imported Calicotta marble. That's the budget for the glass-bottomed car elevator. I am not burying $2 million in a bunch of concrete holes in the ground. The buyers want aesthetics. They don't care about the dirt. The buyers will care when their infinity pool cracks in half and their living room slides into the Pacific. I shot back, my voice remaining completely calm, refusing to match his hysteria. Julian, the physics do not care about your marble. The cliff cannot support the load without the caissons. It is an absolute, non-negotiable structural requirement. Julian paced around his office, his face flushed a deep, furious red. He was watching his profit margins evaporate into the soil. He stopped and pointed a shaking finger at me. I knew it, Julian sneered, his upper lip curling with pure, arrogant contempt. I knew you were going to do this. You've been jealous of me our entire lives. You're furious that Mom gave me the money instead of you. So you manufactured this ridiculous inflated engineering problem just to sabotage my project. You want to bleed my budget dry to punish me. I stared at him. The sheer, breathtaking delusion required to accuse a licensed civil engineer of fabricating a geological slip plane out of sibling rivalry was almost hypnotic. I ran the core samples, Julian. I said softly. The data is irrefutable. You're just a glorified dirt kicker, Clara, Julian yelled, fully abandoning any pretense of brotherly affection. You have absolutely no vision. You live in a boring, miserable little world, and you're trying to drag my masterpiece down into the mud with you. You are ruining my aesthetic. He marched over to the desk, grabbed my meticulously drafted, unstamped blueprints and shoved them back at me. You're fired, Julian spat. Get off my project. I am not paying for your ridiculous concrete anchors. I'll hire a real contractor who actually understands how to build a luxury home efficiently. Do not ever set foot on my property again. I stood perfectly still. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. When an engineer encounters a client who actively demands to build a death trap, we do not throw a tantrum. We do not try to save a man who is enthusiastically fighting to drown. We simply document the refusal, secure our own liability, and step away from the blast radius. I reached down and picked up the thick binder containing the original geological core sample data and the slip plane analysis. I tucked it under my arm, but I didn't take the blueprints. I deliberately left the massive 24 by 36-inch rolls of paper on his desk. They were preliminary designs. They were accurate, but they lacked the one thing that made them legally binding: my embossed federal engineering stamp. Without that stamp, they were just very expensive drawings. Julian glared at me as I turned toward the door. Have a nice life playing in the mud, Clara, he mocked. Good luck with the gravity, Julian, I replied smoothly. I walked out of his office, stepped into the bright Los Angeles sunlight, and felt a profound, dangerous sense of calm settle over my entire body. Julian thought he had just fired a jealous sister to protect his profit margins. He believed he was the smartest man in the room because he only looked at the surface. He had absolutely no idea that by firing me and by keeping those specific unstamped blueprints, he was about to walk directly into the most devastating, legally impenetrable trap a civil engineer could possibly set. To a civilian, the construction of a house is a visual process. You watch the wooden framing go up, you see the drywall installed, and you watch the painters apply the final coat of expensive eggshell white paint. You assume that if a house looks solid on the outside, it is safe on the inside. But to a civil engineer, a building is not a static object. It is a living, breathing system of load transfers and kinetic energy. Every single ounce of weight, the roof, the imported marble, the furniture, the people, must be continuously and flawlessly transferred down through the structural framing, into the foundation, and ultimately into the earth. If you interrupt that load path, the weight doesn't simply disappear. It searches for the path of least resistance, and it will tear the building apart to find it. When I walked out of Julian's Beverly Hills office, leaving my unstamped preliminary blueprints on his glass desk, I didn't go home to cry about my stolen inheritance. I drove directly to my engineering firm, sat down at my computer, and initiated a strict, uncompromising protocol of professional indemnification. In the engineering world, you cannot simply walk away from a structurally compromised project if you have knowledge of a catastrophic defect. If that house slid off the cliff and killed someone, and a subsequent investigation revealed that I had drilled the core samples and known about the slip plane but kept silent, I could lose my federal license and face criminal negligence charges. I drafted a formal letter of withdrawal. It was a cold, heavily documented, 10-page legal declaration. I explicitly stated that I was ceasing all professional involvement with the Malibu project due to the client's refusal to implement the critical, life safety foundational requirements, specifically, the 60-foot steel caissons necessary to anchor the structure through the bentonite clay slip plane. I attached my raw geological data. I attached the soil core sample readouts. I attached the seismic refraction graphs. Then I did the one thing that would legally, permanently detonate Julian's ability to plead ignorance. I filed the letter of withdrawal and the geological addendum directly with the City of Malibu Building and Safety Department, formally lodging it into the public property record for that specific parcel of land. By filing it with the city, the geological instability of the cliff was no longer a private disagreement between siblings. It was a documented, legally binding, known material defect attached to the title of the property. I printed a hard copy, sent it to Julian via certified mail so he could never claim he didn't receive it, and washed my hands of the entire project. For the next 10 months, Julian lived in a state of absolute, arrogant euphoria. He didn't read the dense geological report I mailed him. He threw it in the trash. He hired a fast-track residential architect and a cut-rate structural engineer who was known in the industry for rubber-stamping cheap designs for quick cash. Julian handed them my unstamped preliminary blueprints. They kept the beautiful, sprawling geometric design of the house, but they entirely deleted my subterranean caisson system. Instead, they designed a standard, shallow, matte slab foundation, anchoring it only 10 feet deep into the top layer of sandstone. Julian saved his $1.8 million. He poured a cheap foundation, completely ignoring the massive, slick layer of bentonite clay resting just inches below the concrete. He spent the stolen foundation budget exactly how he said he would. The house became an obscene monument to surface-level wealth. He imported slabs of Calicotta marble from Italy for the floors. He installed a massive, cantilevered infinity pool that hung dangerously over the edge of the cliff. He built the glass-bottomed subterranean garage. He documented every single step on his social media. He posted videos of himself walking through the framed house wearing a designer hard hat, talking to his followers about vision and hustle. He gave interviews to luxury real estate blogs, proclaiming that he was revolutionizing the Malibu coastline. Our extended family fawned over him. My aunts and uncles sent group texts marveling at the pictures of the infinity pool. Julian even went out of his way to text me a photo of the completed gleaming glass and steel facade with the caption, "See? Saved $2 million and the house is perfect. You engineers just overcomplicate things to justify your paychecks." I didn't reply. I just looked at the calendar. It was late October. In Southern California, the dry season was ending. The rainy season was about to begin. When you build a 10,000 square foot house out of steel, glass, and solid Italian marble, you are placing thousands of tons of dead load onto the soil. The top layer of sandstone on Julian's cliff was strong enough to hold that weight when it was bone dry. But physics is an incredibly patient predator. In mid-November, an atmospheric river stalled over the Malibu coast. It rained heavily, unrelentingly, for 2 solid weeks. The water soaked into the earth. It bypassed the shallow 10-foot concrete footings of Julian's cheap foundation. It seeped deeper into the cliff, eventually reaching the angled subterranean layer of bentonite clay. Bentonite clay is highly expansive. When it absorbs water, it swells. And when it becomes fully saturated, it loses all of its sheer strength. It transforms from solid dirt into a slick, frictionless geological slide. Julian had placed a multi-thousand-ton marble and glass box on top of a wet slip and slide, angled directly toward the Pacific Ocean. The failure did not happen all at once. A house doesn't usually snap in half like a cinematic earthquake. It suffers what engineers call differential settlement. One side of the foundation begins to sink and slide faster than the other, causing the entire rigid structure above it to twist. The microfailures began in early December. Julian had just officially listed the mega mansion on the market for $25 million. He was throwing a massive, exclusive Twilight open house for tech billionaires, celebrities, and foreign investors. I wasn't there, of course, but the structural failure of a glass house is impossible to hide from anyone who knows what to look for. According to the desperate, frantic voicemails Julian began leaving for his cheap contractor, which would later become public record in the ensuing lawsuits, the house started speaking to him. At night, when the temperature dropped, the massive steel structural beams would groan and pop loudly as they were subjected to immense, unintended torsional stress. The foundation was slowly, microscopically sliding down the slip plane, dragging the house with it. The first visible casualty was the custom mahogany front door. Because the house was twisting, the door frame was no longer perfectly square. The door began to stick, requiring Julian to forcefully shoulder it open. He paid a handyman to come in and quietly shave a 1/4-inch mahogany front door. They were subjected to a mixer, which would later become, I wasn't there, of course, But the structural failure of a glass house is impossible to hide from anyone who knows what to look for. According to the desperate, frantic voicemails Julian began leaving for his cheap contractor, which would later become public record in the ensuing lawsuits, the house started speaking to him. At night, when the temperature dropped, the massive steel structural beams would groan and pop loudly as they were subjected to immense, unintended torsional stress. The foundation was slowly, microscopically sliding down the slip plane, dragging the house with it. The first visible casualty was the custom mahogany front door. Because the house was twisting, the door frame was no longer perfectly square. The door began to stick, requiring Julian to forcefully shoulder it open. He paid a handyman to come in and quietly shave a 1/4 inch of wood off the top of the door so it would close smoothly. A week later, a jagged hairline crack appeared directly across the center of the imported Italian marble floor in the grand foyer. The concrete slab beneath the marble was fracturing. Julian panicked. He bought an expensive antique Persian rug to cover the crack before a prospective buyer arrived for a viewing. Then came the infinity pool. An infinity pool relies on absolute, millimeter-perfect leveling to allow the water to cascade evenly over the vanishing edge. As the cliffside edge of the foundation began to sink, the pool tilted. The water stopped flowing over the left side of the weir and poured aggressively over the right side, flooding the expensive teak decking. Julian was hemorrhaging cash, paying emergency crews to secretly re-level the pool pump system in the middle of the night so the house would look perfect during the day. He was in a frantic, terrifying race against gravity. He had a tech billionaire interested in the property, and he desperately needed to close the $25 million deal and transfer the title before the house physically tore itself apart. If he closed the sale, the problem belonged to the billionaire. He would be rich, vindicated, and free. The final stage of a California high-end real estate transaction is the seller's disclosure and the buyer's physical inspection. By law, a seller must disclose any known material defects, including geological hazards, foundation issues, or structural settling. Julian, acting with the breathtaking arrogance of a man who believes he can outsmart the law, checked no on every single box on the disclosure form. He formally, legally swore that the property was in flawless condition and entirely free of geological instability. He signed the fraudulent document and submitted it to the escrow company. The tech billionaire's team scheduled their independent inspection for a Tuesday morning in late January. Julian was exhausted, strung out on caffeine and sheer panic, but he was confident. He had patched the drywall cracks. He had hidden the fractured marble under the rugs. He had shaved the doors. He believed that the inspector, typically a general contractor looking for leaky pipes or bad electrical wiring, would walk through the gorgeous sunlit glass box, check a few boxes, and approve the sale. But a $25 million buyer does not hire a standard home inspector. They hire a forensic structural engineering team. I was sitting in my office in downtown Los Angeles, reviewing a municipal bridge blueprint, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but the caller ID indicated it was from a prestigious corporate law firm in Century City. I answered it. "Is this Clara Harrington, senior structural engineer at Apex Geotechnical?" A sharp professional voice asked. "Speaking," I said. "Ms. Harrington, my name is Robert Sterling. I am the managing real estate counsel for the buyer, currently in escrow, on the Malibu property developed by Julian Harrington. I believe he is your brother?" "He is," I replied, my voice perfectly neutral. "Ms. Harrington, our forensic inspection team was on the property this morning," the lawyer explained, his tone carrying the heavy, ominous weight of impending litigation. "They noted severe active differential settlement. A floor-to-ceiling glass pane in the master bedroom experienced critical shear stress and spontaneously shattered while my team was standing in the room." I closed my eyes. The torsion had reached the glass. The structure was actively failing. "I see," I said smoothly. "Upon witnessing the structural failure, our team pulled the complete municipal property records from the city of Malibu," the lawyer continued. "We discovered a formal letter of withdrawal and a comprehensive geological soil report filed by you 10 months ago. The report details a catastrophic bentonite clay slip plane and mandates a deep caisson foundation." "That is correct," I confirmed. I ran the initial core samples. The client refused to implement the required life safety foundational supports, so I formally withdrew my stamp and filed the hazards with the city to indemnify my firm. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, filled only by the quiet hum of the lawyer absorbing the magnitude of the fraud. Julian Harrington submitted a seller's disclosure yesterday, signed under penalty of perjury, claiming there were no known geological defects on this property, the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He actively concealed a registered public geological hazard, built a non-compliant foundation, and attempted to sell a failing structure to my client for $25 million. It appears he did, I said. Thank you for your time, Miss Harrington. Your documentation has been incredibly illuminating. The lawyer hung up. I set my phone down on my desk. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I simply opened my bottom drawer, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and went back to my bridge blueprints. The laws of physics had officially caught up with the aesthetics. Julian's illusion was about to be hit by a wrecking ball of federal litigation. The speed at which a high-powered corporate legal team can dismantle a fraudulent real estate deal is truly a marvel of administrative physics. When a $25 million transaction is abruptly aborted due to active structural failure and documented perjury, the buyer's attorneys do not simply withdraw their funds from escrow and quietly walk away. They deploy a scorched earth protocol to permanently recover their inspection costs and completely insulate their billionaire client from any residual liability. They did exactly what any ruthless, highly competent legal team would do. They immediately forwarded their forensic structural report, along with my original 10-month-old geological withdrawal filing, directly to the chief inspector of the City of Malibu Building and Safety Department, flagging the property as an imminent, critical life safety hazard. The city did not wait for Julian to schedule a meeting. They did not send a polite warning letter in the mail. Less than 48 hours after the tech billionaire's lawyer called my office, a white municipal truck with the city seal on the door pulled into the imported, crushed gravel driveway of Julian's cliffside mega mansion. From the detailed accounts that later surfaced in the civil litigation filings, I know exactly how the scene played out. Julian was inside the house, frantically directing a team of very expensive, very discreet emergency glazers who were attempting to replace the massive pane of shattered floor-to-ceiling glass in the master bedroom. He was sweating through his custom-tailored suit, screaming into his cell phone at his real estate broker, demanding to know why the buyer's escrow funds had suddenly vanished from the holding account without explanation. The heavy custom mahogany front door swung open. The chief city inspector, accompanied by a structural engineer from the municipal planning board and a uniformed police officer, walked into the grand, fractured marble foyer. "Julian Harrington?" the chief inspector asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous, twisting glass box. Julian dropped his phone, his face instantly draining of color. "Who are you? You can't just walk in here. This is a private job site." "Not anymore, Mr. Harrington," the inspector said flatly. He looked down at his boots, noting the jagged, poorly concealed crack running the entire length of the Italian marble. He looked up at the ceiling, where the steel joints were visibly groaning under the active torsional strain. The inspector didn't ask for a tour. He didn't ask to see the blueprints. He reached into his clipboard, pulled out a massive, aggressively neon red placard, and walked directly up to the open front door. With a heavy industrial staple gun, he drove 4 steel staples through the plastic placard, affixing it permanently to the polished mahogany. "Unsafe to occupy, do not enter. This structure has been condemned due to imminent geological and structural failure, by order of the City of Malibu Building and Safety Department." "Hey, stop!" Julian shrieked, lunging forward, his perfectly manicured aesthetic completely shattering into raw, unadulterated panic. "What are you doing? You can't put that on my door. I have a $25 million closing this week. Take that off." "There is no closing, Mr. Harrington," the inspector said coldly, turning to face him. "We received the forensic engineering report from your prospective buyer. We also pulled the historical geological filings for this parcel. You built a 10,000 square foot unanchored deadload directly on top of a documented bentonite clay slip plane. The structure is actively detaching from the cliff face. It's just settling." Julian lied, his voice cracking hysterically. Every new house settles. I hired a licensed structural engineer. The city approved the shallow foundation. The city approved a shallow foundation because you submitted a fraudulent geological survey generated by a cut-rate contractor who explicitly ignored the original, stamped warning from Apex Geotechnical. The municipal engineer interrupted, entirely immune to Julian's volume. You bypassed a critical life safety mandate. As of right now, all certificates of occupancy for this parcel are permanently revoked. The emergency glazers need to pack their tools and evacuate immediately. No one is allowed inside this structure. It is a death trap. Julian stood in the foyer, trembling violently. He looked at the red tag on the door. In commercial real estate development, a red, condemned tag is not just a delay. It is an absolute, instantaneous financial execution. Julian had built the house using a massive, high-interest commercial construction loan. Construction loans are short-term volatile instruments. The bank only issues the final long-term mortgage conversion when the city issues a certificate of occupancy. By permanently revoking that certificate and red tagging the property, the city had just triggered an automatic, catastrophic default on Julian's multi-million-dollar debt. You are destroying my life, Julian whispered, clutching his chest, the reality of the mathematical gravity finally crushing the breath out of his lungs. The earth is destroying your house, Mr. Harrington, the inspector replied. We are just keeping it from taking anyone with it. Everyone out, now. The confrontation Julian desperately needed to have was not with the city. It was with the only person who could possibly alter the historical geological record. He didn't call me. He knew I wouldn't answer. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the glass-walled main conference room of my engineering firm in downtown Los Angeles, reviewing a soil density report with 2 junior partners. The heavy glass door of our lobby flew open. Julian bypassed the receptionist entirely, storming down the hallway with the frantic, deranged energy of a man whose entire universe had just been set on fire. He burst into the conference room. He looked absolutely abhorrent. His expensive suit jacket was discarded. His silk tie was loosened, and his hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. Clara! Julian gasped, slamming his hands down on the polished conference table, startling my junior partners. You have to fix this. You have to fix this right now. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the 2 junior engineers. Gentlemen, please excuse us for a moment, I said calmly. We will resume the density analysis in 15 minutes. They nodded, quickly gathering their tablets and hurried out of the room, closing the glass door behind them. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, folded my hands neatly on top of my blueprints and looked at my brother. Fix what, Julian? I asked softly. The city, Julian screamed, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. They red-tagged the house. They condemned it. The buyer's lawyers found your withdrawal letter. They found the slip plane report. They pulled my funding. He stopped pacing and threw himself into the chair across from me, leaning aggressively over the table. You set me up, he hissed, his face twisted in a mixture of profound rage and desperate pleading. You filed that geological report just to sabotage me, because you were jealous of Mom's money. But you can undo it, Clara. You're a senior partner here. You have to call the city. You have to tell them you made a mistake on the core samples. Tell them the bedrock is stable. I'll pay you. I'll give you half the profit from the sale. Just unfile the report. I stared at him. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the request was a testament to how completely insulated he had been from reality his entire life. He genuinely believed that a federal engineering license was just a piece of paper you could use to lie your way out of a consequence. I cannot unfile the laws of physics, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, clinical register that left absolutely no room for interpretation. I did not make a mistake on the core samples. The bentonite clay is real. The slip plane is real, and the torsion currently destroying your house is real. I cannot alter the geological record, and even if I could, I would not risk my federal license and criminal negligence charges to subsidize your arrogance. I am going to lose everything, Clara, Julian roared, pounding his fist on the table. The construction loan went into default the second the red tag was stapled to the door. The bank is calling the note. They're going to foreclose on the property. They're going to seize my corporate accounts. They're going to take my cars. You didn't build a house, Julian, I said smoothly. You built a landslide, and you financed it with stolen money. I simply refused to stand at the bottom of the hill when it let go. Mom wanted me to have that money, he cried, tears of pure panic finally spilling over his eyelashes. She believed in my vision. You are destroying her legacy. Mom didn't understand soil mechanics, I replied flatly. And neither did you. I handed you the exact blueprints required to secure that foundation. I told you it would cost $1.8 million. You chose to spend that money on Italian marble and an infinity pool, assuming the earth would simply support your ego because you wanted it to. You bought the aesthetics, Julian, but you refused to pay for the foundation. And now, gravity is collecting the debt. Julian slumped back in his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was hyperventilating, the frantic, ragged breaths of a man who realizes he is entirely out of options. What am I supposed to do? He whispered into his palms, sounding like a terrified child. The bank. The lawsuit from the buyer for the disclosure fraud. How do I fix it? You don't, I said. I stood up from the conference table. The house cannot be saved. The structural twisting is fatal. The city will not allow you to leave a condemned, shifting dead load hanging over a public beach. By the end of the month, the municipality will issue a mandatory abatement order. Julian looked up through his fingers, his eyes red and swollen. An abatement order? What does that mean? It means, I stated with absolute, merciless precision, that the city will legally force you to hire a specialized demolition crew to completely dismantle your $15 million glass mansion, piece by piece, to remove the hazard. And because your construction loan is in default, the bank will not pay for it. You will have to pay the multi-million-dollar demolition costs out of your own pocket. And when the cliff is finally reduced to an empty dirt lot, the bank will foreclose on the soil. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The psychological blow was total. He wasn't just losing the house. He was going to be forced to pay millions of dollars to actively destroy his own masterpiece. I suggest you call a very good bankruptcy attorney, Julian, I advised quietly. And perhaps a criminal defense lawyer. Perjury on a $25 million seller's disclosure carries a mandatory federal sentence. I picked up my pen, turned my back on the man who had stolen my inheritance, and walked out of the conference room. The physical conclusion of Julian's architectural delusion occurred exactly 3 weeks later. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Another massive, relentless Pacific storm front had rolled into Southern California. The rain was torrential, completely saturating the Malibu coastline. The bentonite clay slip plane beneath Julian's property hit its absolute point of total liquid saturation. The friction coefficient dropped to 0. The event was caught on camera by a local news helicopter that was patrolling the coastline for mudslide footage. It did not happen violently. It was a slow, agonizing, perfectly mathematical surrender to gravity. The shallow, 10-foot concrete footings of the foundation simply detached from the earth. The massive, cantilevered infinity pool cracked directly in half, sending a tidal wave of chlorinated water rushing down the cliff. The entire 10,000-square-foot structure, the steel beams, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the imported Italian marble, and the glass-bottomed garage, slid off the edge of the cliff in one agonizing, groaning mass. It crashed onto the rocky beach below, exploding into a chaotic, twisted pile of shattered glass, bent steel, and pulverized concrete. And Julian's grand $25 million illusion was reduced to a pile of toxic industrial debris in exactly 14 seconds. I watched the footage on the evening news from the quiet comfort of my apartment. I watched the helicopter zoom in on the debris field. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt the profound, sterile satisfaction of an equation balancing perfectly to 0. The legal and financial aftermath was an absolute bloodbath. Because Julian had checked no on the seller's disclosure form regarding geological hazards, despite my formal filing existing in the public record, the tech billionaire's legal team pressed for criminal fraud charges. Julian was indicted for felony perjury and attempted wire fraud. To avoid federal prison, Julian took a plea deal. He was forced into absolute, total Chapter 7 liquidation bankruptcy. The bank seized everything. They took the leased Porsches, they emptied his corporate accounts, and they liquidated his flashy Beverly Hills office. Because the house had fallen onto a public beach, the California Coastal Commission hit Julian with a staggering $5 million environmental cleanup fine. He couldn't pay it. The state garnished his future wages indefinitely. The luxury lifestyle entrepreneur, who had bragged to 1 million Instagram followers about his visionary genius, was now legally forbidden from holding a corporate real estate license or acting as a fiduciary in the state of California for the rest of his life. I heard from a distant cousin that Julian is currently living in a rented, one-bedroom apartment in the San Fernando Valley, working an entry-level desk job at an auto insurance firm. He doesn't post on social media anymore. There is no aesthetic left to curate when the foundation of your entire life has slid into the ocean. My life, however, moved forward with absolute, unshakable stability. A year after the collapse, my engineering firm promoted me to managing partner. I oversee the geotechnical divisions for the largest municipal infrastructure projects in the state. I bought my own house, a modest, beautiful, mid-century home in the foothills. Before I signed the escrow papers, I personally ran the soil density tests in the backyard. My foundation is bolted directly into solid granite. It isn't flashy. It doesn't have an infinity pool. But it will outlast me by 100 years. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. They ask if I should have tried harder to convince my brother to build the caissons, or if I should have warned him before I filed the hazard report with the city. They think that because he is family, I owed him a duty to protect him from his own ignorance. I always give them the exact same answer. I didn't destroy my brother. I didn't forge documents, and I didn't push his house off a cliff. My brother destroyed himself through his own profound, breathtaking arrogance. He looked at a masterpiece of natural deadly physics and only saw the aesthetic he wanted to paste over it. He believed that because he was loud, aggressive, and wore an expensive suit, the earth would simply suspend the laws of gravity to accommodate his ego. He assumed my boundaries were weak because I didn't scream or throw tantrums when he stole my inheritance. He didn't realize that in civil engineering, the strongest forces are the ones you cannot hear. A steel anchor doesn't make a sound once it is buried in the bedrock, but it can hold a skyscraper steady in a hurricane. I didn't set a trap. I simply calculated the load, handed him the math, and let his own refusal to build a foundation snap the jaws shut. You cannot pave over a structural deficit with imported marble. You cannot outmarket a geological slip plane. And you can never, ever expect a master engineer to compromise the integrity of their life's work just to subsidize your illusion. That is my story. A stolen $2 million inheritance, an unanchored cliffside mega mansion, and the exact moment a family's golden child realized he had fired the only person keeping him from falling into the sea. If you are the person in your life whose expertise is constantly minimized, whose quiet focus is mistaken for weakness, and whose boundaries are treated as mere suggestions by loud, arrogant people, take this as your absolute vindication. Do not yell at them. Do not try to explain the complexity of your work to people who only understand the surface. Quietly secure your own foundation, extract your liability, and step back from the blast radius. Gravity always wins. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this story reminded you to always check the soil reports, and to never let anyone else compromise your structural integrity, please share it with someone who needs the strength to hold their ground. Drop a comment below with the word anchored to let me know you stayed until the dust settled. Hit that subscribe button for more true stories about quiet victories, and I will see you in the next drama story.